Florin Diacu is a former political refugee and current professor of mathematics at the University of Victoria. He has written a book called The Lost Millennium. It explores the astonishing possibility that our calendar is out by 1,000 years or so. And as you know, those whose chronology is confused cannot give a true account of history. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Florin Diacu to Studio 4 to tell us more. Where did the time go? We're going to find out, if it went anywhere. Good morning.
Good morning, Fanny.
What started you on this quest?
It's an interesting story. I was in Mexico at a conference, and I met a friend there, also a Romanian originally. And during lunch, he told me about another colleague of ours, a Russian professor of mathematics, who challenges the existing historical chronology. So after I heard about that, I tried to find out more and to read about these things. And slowly I started researching the problem, and that's how I got to write the book.
And I'm sure very slowly, because this is complicated. You must have a deep passion for history as well as mathematics, because chronology is really about history.
It is. In fact, first I wanted to become a historian, but then my skills for mathematics convinced me that I should do mathematics instead.
Right. So you took your mathematics hat off a little bit to study other things. But is math somehow involved in the study of timetables, history's timetables?
It is. So my expertise is in fact in celestial mechanics, which is in fact mathematics, because you have to solve some so-called differential equations in order to know how the planets move, how the when eclipses occur, and in fact the sky and the planets, the motion of the planets, are like a clock for history, because once you have, say, a record of historical eclipses or a record of a horoscope,
right?
Because a horoscope tells you the position of the planets with respect to the constellations. So once you know that, you can compute back in time when they happened.
Aha. So somebody like Isaac Newton, who used to study Egyptian horoscopes, he was onto something, was he? Was he studying timetables or what?
So, well, Isaac Newton didn't look exactly at directed astronomical aspects.
Right.
He looked at the Argonautic expedition, and he tried to understand how, when this happened, looking at the motion of the planets. So he was the first one who realized that legends may play a role in history.
Aha. And he had something to do with gravity, didn't he?
Well, yeah, but that
somewhere in
was
there.
Another matter.
Another matter. So where did you start on this? There's lots of characters in this book. It's all true. It's not fiction. It's all true.
Absolutely true. Everything I wrote there.
How did you find the characters or the scientists who you think know what they're talking about when it comes to our calendar? Well, where do they live?
Yeah, when you research such a thing, any book you write, you have to do your research first.
Yeah.
And it's not something linear. You go back and forth. You find another reference. So what started me, when I realized that this is something really important, was when I fell upon a French scholar. His name was Joseph Scaliger. He lived more than 400 years ago. And he's, in fact, the father of historical chronology. He was just an amazing personality. He mastered 13 languages. This was, at the end of the 16th century.
A smart guy.
Yes, well, he knew mathematics, he knew astronomy. And he wrote a book in which he connected the historical events from Europe with those of the Near East. So he created this global chronology. In fact, it was not very much known about him until a Princeton professor, his name is Anthony Grafton, a couple of decades ago, rediscovered him somehow and wrote several books about Scaliger. So Scaliger wrote himself a huge volume of 7 volumes, a book of 7 volumes in which he studied 50 calendars that didn't exist in his time anymore. They were not used anymore. and of course are not used today. But you see, understanding the calendars is not enough in order to tell when historical events happen, because every calendar has an era, so a starting point. For example, for our calendar, the starting point is the year 1 AD. Now, the question is, whenever you talk about a foreign calendar, an unknown calendar, when is that? When did that starting point happen?
On the foreign calendar?
On the foreign calendar, on the unknown calendar, the one that is not used today anymore.
Right.
And how can you find out that? Well, you look at astronomy, for example. That's what Scaliger did in his time. There was no radiocarbon method. There was no dendrochronology. There were no scientific dating methods such that he could determine when
Right, he wasn't studying tree rings.
No, he was
No.
not. He was not studying tree rings. He had nothing but astronomy at his disposal. So that's what he did.
Yes.
And let me give you an example such that you understand how difficult it is to find out when certain historical events happen. So,
Okay, I'm good. I was good in algebra. I can do an algebraic equation, and that's about where my knowledge stops.
okay, well,
So keep it simple.
I'm not going to get into the mathematics. I
Okay.
just want to tell you about an astronomical event. So there is a famous book by Thucydides. Thucydides was a Greek historian.
Right.
And he wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War.
Right.
Now, according to tradition, and to Scaliger, because Scaliger fixed the date of the Peloponnesian War, the war started in 431 BC. How could he find out that? That's the question. Well, during the time of the war, so when the war started, there was a solar eclipse. And it was a total solar eclipse because Thucydides says he could see stars during the eclipse. Then he tells us that 7 years later there was another eclipse. The war, by the way, the war lasted 27 years. So 11 years after the second eclipse was a lunar eclipse. So a sequence of this kind happens very rarely in history. And we can compute back in time when that happened. Now, Scaliger fixed everything to 431 BC, so the beginning of the war, and after that, historians started to construct history from here,
Right.
connecting with so what happened in other documents, what was written in other documents, and so on. The trouble is that at the end of the 19th century, astronomers realized that the 431 BC eclipse was not total; it was a partial one.
Really?
Yes.
So that means
That means that probably that year, if we accept Thucydides,
The
if we
theory.
accept his word for that, it means that it couldn't have been 431 BC. We have two more solutions, and
Yes.
mathematicians have found out that one of them is in the 11th century AD, and another one is in the 12th century AD. So this is much later than 431 BC, of course.
So cutting to the chase, did we have a Middle Ages? Did they happen?
Well, that's exactly what Anatoly Fomenko says, that there were no Middle Ages, that they are just an invention, that they just, were created artificially
Yes.
by Scaliger and by his followers. Now, of course, in this book, I'm not saying that he's right.
No.
On the contrary, I'm trying to be objective and to present both sides of the story
Right.
and of the debate.
But you are posing the question. We should ask
I
this
do.
because I guess the real question is, why should I care if we've lost a millennium? What does it matter to me,
Well,
living here in Vancouver in 2006, if it is 2006?
Well, we do care about history and we do care about culture because if we don't understand the past, we cannot learn from it and we cannot
Right.
really be ready for the future.
Sure. When was Jesus born?
That's another question, and Fomenko and his colleagues point out that the events described in the Bible, and not just in the Bible, like the Dead Sea Scrolls and
Sure, the holy books and-
other manuscripts that we have, somehow all the events described there point out towards the year 1000, so the 11th century AD, not the 1st century AD.
Wow.
On the other hand, I'm a bit skeptical about Jesus as a chronological figure. He's, of course, a great religious figure. But from the chronological point of view, I wouldn't put too much weight on him, because everything that was written about him is veiled somehow in legend. So it's very difficult to separate fiction from truth.
Sure. Is it linear, or is it legend? Look at the Trojan War.
Yeah.
When did Troy fall? When?
Well, it depends whom you ask. Because, for example, Scaliger says one thing, Newton puts the Trojan War like 400 years later.
Who to believe?
Yeah.
It'd be great to be in a history class, wouldn't it? And your teacher says, well, when did the Trojan War happen? And you get it wrong, and you say, aha, but read this book, The Lost Millennium.
Well,
we may not know.
Amazing is that historical dates from antiquity are not ironclad. That's what, in fact, the conclusion of this book is.
Right.
There is a lot of debate about that.
There are chronological revisionists about who have been here a long time,
yes,
as you know. Is there one you really trust, you think is onto something? Fomenko, you mentioned, the Russian scholar, who seems to have most of his facts in place, but do you believe it?
Well, there are two things to look at here. So one is whether traditional chronology is correct, and the other one is whether Fomenko's chronology, because he has his own chronology,
right,
whether that one is correct. Well, I don't think his chronology is correct. He has some good points in his arguments. Some of his arguments are very good, but he also blunders. For example, when he gets into linguistics, his linguistics arguments
don't fly.
Don't fly.
So, if you look at an age when people were making art and discovering things, the discovery of penicillin, making fine art in the Renaissance, is there a gap in history somewhere where we don't see any fruits of man's labor or woman's labor? Do you know what I mean? With the cultural, what happened in this age culturally?
The Middle Ages are not very well documented. So, and besides that, you see, there are some contradictions that show up. For example, how could military history, so the military achievements that the Romans had, simply vanish in the Middle Ages? I mean, no matter who is the leader of a country, who is the king there, nobody would just forget to defend the country somehow. So
no.
where did they vanish for all this time? So you see,